Welcome back to the 2024 edition of the Security Plus Exam Cram series, and in this installment we mark the end of Domain 1 with Section 1.4, where we'll focus on the importance of appropriate cryptographic solutions. We're going to talk about public key infrastructure, which goes hand in hand with certificates. We'll look at an array of certificate types and where they fit, and we'll dive into encryption technologies and cryptographic concepts too numerous to mention. This is the biggest section of Domain 1, a lot of material to cover, so let's get started. Welcome back to the Security Plus Exam Cram series 2024 edition. In our continuing coverage of Domain 1, in this session, we'll focus on Section 1.4, which covers cryptographic solutions. More specifically, explaining the importance of appropriate cryptographic solutions. We're going to cover public key infrastructure, or PKI, a variety of encryption mechanisms, both types of encryption and scope of encryption, encryption-related tools, obfuscation techniques, a number of encryption concepts including hashing, salting, digital signatures, key stretching, blockchain, and open public ledger. And finally, a number of certificate types. Now, PKI and certificates are directly related because we produce certificates from a PKI system. So I'm going to cover certificates right after PKI to keep these two together to make your job in preparing for exam day a bit easier. But beyond that, I'm going to cover everything else in the order presented, as I always do. Let's dive right into public key infrastructure concepts. Beginning with key management, which is management of cryptographic keys in a crypto system. So operational considerations include dealing with generation, exchange, storage, use, and crypto shredding or destruction, and replacement of keys if a key is lost or expires. From a design perspective, we have to look at cryptographic protocol design, key servers, user procedures, and any related protocols related to management updates and revocation. The certificate authorities create digital certificates and own the policies related to certificate creation, functionality, and issuance. Now, a PKI hierarchy can include a single certificate authority that serves as the root and the issuing CA and manages all the policies, but this is not recommended because if that server is compromised, your entire PKI hierarchy itself is compromised. There's really no way back from that sort of breach. You'll have to start from scratch. You may also hear a certificate authority called a certification authority by some vendors. Microsoft is one of those. Just know those are two ways of saying the same thing. For best security, you'll see a 3-tier PKI system with an issuing CA as the first layer, a subordinate or intermediate CA, sometimes called a policy CA, as the second layer, and then a root certificate authority at the top. So the root CA is usually maintained in an offline state. This will typically only be brought online for specific operations, like issuing certificates to new subordinate CAs. You'll see that subordinate CA, sometimes called a policy CA or an intermediate CA, multiple names for the same thing. And its role is to issue certificates to new issuing certificate authorities. And the issuing CA focuses on exactly that, issuing certificates for clients, servers, devices, websites, etc. That represents your chain of trust. And this can be consolidated into fewer servers, fewer layers, creating a 1 or 2 level hierarchy. Generally speaking, in production, you want a 2-layer hierarchy at minimum. So if you have a breach, for example, of your issuing CA, you can redeploy that without having to start from scratch. And in a 3-tier system, you could have a breach at the issuing or subordinate levels and still recover by revoking and reissuing new certificates for subordinate and issuing CAs. The certificate revocation list contains information about any certificates that have been revoked due to compromises to the certificate itself or to the PKI hierarchy. The CRL of the issuing CA contains information on revocation of certificates it has issued to clients, devices, for websites, etc. And CAs are required to publish CRLs, but it's up to certificate consumers if they check these lists and how they respond if a certificate has been revoked. For example, if you have a web application to which clients authenticate with a certificate, it's up to that web application to go check the CRL of that PKI to see if the certificate is indeed still valid or it has been revoked for some reason. So each certificate revocation list is published to a file, and that client must download that file to check, and this file can grow quite large over time in busy environments. And that fact led to the creation of Online Certificate Status Protocol, or OSCP, which offers a faster way to check a certificate status compared to downloading a CRL. With OCSP, the consumer of a certificate can submit a request to the issuing CA to obtain the status of a specific certificate, rather than downloading that entire list. So some other terms related to PKI you should be familiar with include the Certificate Signing Request, or CSR. The CSR records identifying information for a person or a device that owns a private key, as well as information on the corresponding public key. It's the message that's sent to the CA in order to get a digital certificate created. The common name, or CN, that appears on a certificate is the fully qualified domain name of the entity represented, such as the web server. So I've mentioned online and offline certificate authority. So an online CA is always running, an offline CA is kept offline except for issuance and renewal operations. Offline is considered a best practice for your root certificate authority. There is certificate stapling, which is a method used with OCSP which allows a web server to provide information on the validity of its own certificate. It's done by the web server essentially downloading the OCSP response from the certificate vendor in advance and providing it to browsers. And then there's pinning, which is a method designed to mitigate the use of fraudulent certificates. Once a public key or certificate has been seen for a specific host, that key or certificate is pinned to the host. And at that point, should a different key or certificate be seen for that host, that might indicate an issue with a fraudulent certificate. Certificate chaining refers to the fact that certificates are handled by a chain of trust. So you purchase a digital certificate from a certificate authority, so you trust that CA certificate, and in turn that CA trusts a root certificate in its hierarchy. The trust model in a PKI is a model of how different certificate authorities trust each other and how their clients will trust certificates from other certification authorities. The four main types of trust models that are used in PKI are bridge, hierarchical, hybrid, and mesh. What you're going to see in your own organization is that hierarchical structure that I showed you with an issuing CA, a policy CA, and a root CA. In very large organizations or between organizations that are collaborating in some unique way, you may see hybrid or bridge type trust models where they're creating trust between their disparate hierarchies. Hierarchical is going to be the norm, and that's what you really need to think about for the exam. They're not going to get into the weeds on the different trust models, but know those four main types by name. Then we have key escrow, which addresses the possibility that a cryptographic key may be lost. The concern is usually with symmetric keys or with the private key in asymmetric cryptography. Because remember, the public key in asymmetric cryptography is shared by design. So if they lose that key, there's no way to get the key back, and the user can't then decrypt messages. And organizations establish key escrows precisely to enable that recovery of lost keys. I don't know for certain that certificate formats will come up on the exam, what we call X.509 certificate formats. That's technically the type of certificates we're dealing with here. You'll sometimes hear them called SSL or TLS certificates. In reality, TLS has supplanted or replaced SSL. So in this table, in column 2, I have the file extension, which tips you off to the format of the certificate, and column 3 tells you if the private key is included in that file. Remembering if you're trying to install a certificate on a new device or transfer a certificate, it's not whole without the private key. Many times what you'll find is a certificate is issued and the private key is marked as not exportable, meaning you can't export the whole certificate and transfer it somewhere else. There are a few certificate types you should know for the exam as well. So we have a user certificate, which is used to represent a user's digital identity. In most cases, a user certificate is mapped back to a user account. We have a root certificate, which is a trust anchor in a PKI environment. It's the root certificate from which the whole chain of trust is derived. That's the root CA. We have certificates used for domain validation. So a domain validated certificate is an X.509 certificate that proves the ownership of a domain name. An extended validation certificate provides a higher level of trust in identifying the entity that is using the certificate. This is common in the financial services sector. When money is on the line, it raises the bar. But when we look at that hierarchy, the root CA is the root of trust. So to recap, in a PKI, the root certificate serves as the trust anchor, as it is the most trusted component of the system. And your organization's root certificate will be deployed to your organization's devices to the list of trusted certificate authorities. But generally speaking, your CA's root certificate is only known and trusted within your organization. So for external, customer-facing, vendor-facing use cases, we need to take a different approach. For resources accessed externally, you'll buy a certificate from a trusted third party. Some examples would include DigiCert, Entrust, GlobalSign, GoDaddy. They all offer certificates for purchase. So the root CAs in their organizations and their hierarchies will be widely trusted and generally pre-installed on most devices out there, computers and phones and the like. In fact, let me just show you this. So think of the certificate of a root CA as your root of trust, but let me just show you the trust hierarchy and that root of trust in the real world on a device. So I've launched the certificate snap-in on my computer here, and I'm looking at the certificate store for the local computer. So I'll drill down into certificates here, and for example, I see a Microsoft Intune MDM device CA. So that's a client certificate for my device. If I double click on that certificate, I can see when it's valid, when it was issued. When I look at the details, I can scroll down and look at the enhanced key usage, which tells me what it's used for. It's used for client authentication. So for this client, this device to authenticate to Intune. But what about that chain of trust up to the root of trust? If I go to certification path, you'll see the certificate, the MDM device CA from which it was issued, and then the Microsoft Intune root certification authority. So there is your chain of trust up to the root of trust. Now, what about those trusted third parties that we would leverage for external facing use cases when we're communicating with entities that need that trust outside of our organization? Well, if I go buy a certificate from a third party, if you see here under Trusted Root Certification Authorities, I can see the certificates of Trusted Root CAs, and you will see all those companies I mentioned. DigiCert, which has multiple root CAs as you can see, Entrust, GlobalSign, GoDaddy, and others. These were all pre-installed on this device. I didn't have to do anything beyond installing Windows. But if I work for, let's say, Contoso, the only reason my root CA certificate will be here is because either, one, it's integrated with Active Directory Domain Services, what we'd call an enterprise PKI, at which point it more or less gets installed automatically, or the IT team has, through some other means, installed that root CA on my device, so it is then a trusted source. PKI is a pretty complicated subject. If you get good at PKI in your career, early in your career, it's going to serve you well. But I hope that clears up some of the basics. Let's talk through a few more certificate types. We have the wildcard certificate that can be used for a domain and a subdomain. So for example, in the Contoso.com domain, we have two servers called Web and Mail. The wildcard certificate is an *.contoso.com, and when installed, it would work for the fully qualified domain names of both of these. In short, a wildcard certificate can be used for multiple servers in the same domain, which will save us on costs, particularly if we're buying certificates for external-facing functions. But it supports multiple FQDNs in the same domain. Next, we have a code signing certificate. So when code is distributed over the internet, it's essential that users can trust that it was actually produced by the claimed sender. For example, an attacker would like to produce a fake device driver or web component that's actually malware that is claimed to be from some legitimate software vendor. Using a code signing certificate to digitally sign the code mitigates this danger of malware, because that bad actor won't have access to the PKI organization to produce such a code signing certificate for that software vendor's domain. A code signing certificate provides proof of content integrity. Next, we have a self-signed certificate, which is a certificate issued by the same entity that's using it. However, it does not have a certificate revocation list and cannot be validated or trusted. It's the cheapest form of internal certificates and can be placed on multiple servers. You should only use self-signed certificates in test and development scenarios that should never be used for production, generally speaking. If you need actual trust, a self-signed certificate is not going to do the job. If you need to simulate that trust with a certificate for test and development, a self-signed certificate's just fine. We have a machine or computer certificate, which is used to identify a computer within a domain. Email certificates allow users to digitally sign their emails to verify their identity through the attestation of a trusted third party known as a certificate authority. And this can allow the users to encrypt the entire contents, messages, attachments, etc. And then we have a third-party certificate, a certificate issued by a widely trusted external provider such as GoDaddy or DigiCert. This is strongly preferred for TLS on public-facing services like a company website, because as you saw in the demo, the root of trust for that widely trusted third party is already present on most devices, already trusted by virtually all organizations out there. Next, we have the Subject Alternative Name, or SAN certificate, which is an extension to the X.509 specification that allows users to specify additional host names for a single SSL or TLS certificate. It's standard practice for SSL certificates, and it's on its way to replacing the use of common name. You can also insert other information into a SAN certificate, like an IP address. So we don't even have to use just names. We could use IP addresses as well. So this enables support for FQDNs from multiple domains in a single certificate. So remember, with the wildcard certificate, we could support multiple host names for the same domain. With a SAN certificate, we can support FQDNs for multiple domains, and we can add IP addresses in there so we can navigate to an IP address in a browser. We don't even need a name. And be aware of certificate expiration. Certificates are valid for a limited period from the date of issuance, as specified on the certificate. The industry standard moves over time. Current industry guidance, last I checked, was a maximum certificate lifetime from widely trusted authorities like DigiCert at 398 days, a little over 1 year. Will organizations cheat on that and issue for a little longer so they have to buy certificates less often? Yes, they will. Particularly if you're buying a subject alternative name certificate from an external source that supports many names, those can get quite expensive, into the hundreds of dollars, so I do see folks cheat on the lifetime. Not a crisis if you're maintaining securely, but you need to balance cost and security to be sure. Next, we'll take a look at encryption by level or scope. So we'll start with file encryption, which operates at the individual file level, meaning files could have unique encryption keys. This would be useful for files containing sensitive info, of course. This could be financial data, protected health information, personally identifiable information, or PHI and PII, respectively. Volume encryption, which is encryption that targets a specific partition or volume within the physical drive. It's useful when different volumes need varying levels of protection. So in the Windows or Linux world, think about the data volume versus the system volume. One where data lives, the other where the operating system lives. Then we have disk encryption, which automatically encrypts data when it is written to or read from the entire disk. This would be BitLocker on Windows, Encrypt on Linux, but you can see that when we look at this from the perspective of scope, the scope of encryption at the file level is very low, very granular, and the scope of encryption at the disk level is very high. We're encrypting everything. So basically the scope is inversely proportional to the granularity. And I called out partition or volume there, so those are actually two separate concepts, and I want to touch on those to make sure you're clear in case something comes up on the exam. The partition represents a distinct section of storage on a disk. On Windows, the C drive is typically a primary partition. It's a distinct physical section of the storage, typically. Volume represents a logical division of a storage device. It represents a single accessible storage area, and a volume can span multiple partitions or disks even. But a volume logically assembles one or more partitions into a unified storage area. I don't expect the exam's going to get too wound up around that detail, but I wanted to call it out just in case. So let's talk about drive encryption. We have full disk encryption, FDE for short, which is built into the Windows operating system. That's BitLocker, and BitLocker protects disks, volumes, and partitions. Then there's a self-encrypting drive, which is encryption on a drive that's built into the hardware of the drive itself. Anything that's written to that drive is automatically stored in encrypted form, and a good self-encrypting drive should follow the Opal storage specification. So if we just go under the hood, we're really talking about protecting data at rest here. So full disk encryption under the hood uses a system's trusted platform module. The TPM is on the motherboard. It's used to store encryption keys so that when a system boots, it can compare keys and ensure that the system has not been tampered with. We call this a hardware root of trust. When using certificates for full disk encryption, they use a hardware root of trust that verifies the keys match before the secure boot process takes place. A TPM is a hardware root of trust. Now I mentioned self-encrypting drives should use the Opal storage specification, which is the industry standard for self-encrypting drives. It's a hardware solution that outperforms software-based alternatives. And they don't have the same vulnerabilities as software and therefore are generally considered to be more secure. They're solid-state drives, they're purchased already set up to encrypt data at rest, and the encryption keys are stored on the hard drive controller. They are immune to a cold boot attack and are compatible with all operating systems. So the self-encrypting drive is effective in protecting data on lost or stolen devices, such as a laptop, because only the user and the vendor can decrypt the data. There are a couple of other data at rest scenarios we should touch on. One is cloud storage encryption. Your cloud service providers, your CSPs like Microsoft Azure, Google, and Amazon Web Services, they usually protect data at rest automatically, encrypting before persisting it to manage disks, blob storage, file, or queue storage. Amazon went through years of grief because in the early going they didn't automatically encrypt data, didn't automatically protect it at rest, which led to some breaches of aging cloud storage out there that customers didn't get rid of in a timely fashion. Then we have transparent data encryption, which helps protect SQL database and data warehouses against the threat of malicious activity, with real-time encryption and decryption of database backups and transaction log files at rest without requiring app changes. And notice I mentioned it's real-time encryption and with nearly zero performance impact. And you'll find this is available for multiple flavors of relational database management systems out there, from Microsoft SQL to MySQL to PostgreSQL. Most have some form of transparent encryption. I may use that CSP acronym more than once in our sessions through this series. CSP equals Cloud Service Provider, and there I'm talking about Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, and Amazon Web Services, or any other public cloud provider in that vein. The syllabus mentions transport or communication. We're talking about data in transit. Data in transit is most often encrypted with TLS or HTTPS. This is typically how a session would be encrypted before a user enters credit card details in a web transaction, for example. And while similar in function, TLS has largely replaced SSL. So when you see TLS and SSL used interchangeably, TLS is really what's typically being used there. TLS is common for encrypting a widespread variety of network communications like VPN as well. You'll also hear data in transit called data in motion, two ways of saying the same thing. You may see mention of protecting data in use or data in processing, two ways of saying the same thing. And data in use occurs when we launch an application like Microsoft Word or Adobe Acrobat. Apps not running the data from the disk drive, but running the application in RAM, in random access memory. This is volatile memory, meaning that should you power down the computer, the contents are erased. But nonetheless, in some cases, data in memory will be encrypted. One place it comes in mind is with the credential guard feature in Windows. They're encrypting your password hashes in memory, so if they're dumped, they're not accessible. I want to revisit data protection in relational databases because we can go beyond encrypting at the database level. Many of your relational databases support row or column level encryption. Row level encrypts an entire record. Column level encrypts specific fields within the record. This is commonly implemented within the database tier. I would say it's also possible in code of your front-end applications if you wanted to do it that way. We see masking done that way. And to restate it here briefly with the other relational database encryption options, transparent data encryption. It's full database level encryption. Database files, logs, backups, requires no changes in application, comes with virtually no performance impact, and is offered on most relational database management platforms. MySQL, Microsoft SQL, PostgreSQL, MariaDB, and it's usually available in PaaS versions of these services in the cloud as well. So let's move on to symmetric and asymmetric encryption. So symmetric relies heavily on the use of a shared secret key. It lacks support for scalability, easy key distribution, and non-repudiation. So when I say lacks support, I mean it does not support scalability to many users because distributing that key is challenging, that single shared key. Asymmetric, which relies on public-private key pairs for communications between parties, supports scalability, easy key distribution, and non-repudiation. It doesn't mean one is better than the other, it just means their most useful purpose differs. So, asymmetric keys, the public keys are shared amongst communicating parties, private keys are kept secret. So when we're dealing with data to encrypt a message, we use the recipient's public key. To decrypt a message, you use your own private key. With digital signatures, to sign a message, you use your own private key. To validate a signature, other users would use the sender's public key. So if you're the sender, they'll use your public key. But each party in asymmetric encryption has both a private key and a public key. So how are asymmetric and symmetric encryption commonly used? Well, symmetric is typically used for bulk encryption, encrypting large amounts of data because it can do so very fast with that single shared key. Asymmetric encryption is used for distribution of symmetric bulk encryption keys, that shared key we talked about. It's commonly used in identity authentication via digital signatures and certificates, and for non-repudiation services and key agreement. So in that respect, the two can be used together. Symmetric algorithms can encrypt large amounts of data much faster than asymmetric, but an asymmetric algorithm can allow us to distribute that shared key securely to large numbers of parties. So I want to show you how those private and public key pairs are used in an example scenario. So here we have Franco and Maria. So Franco sends a message to Maria requesting her public key. Maria sends her public key to Franco. Franco uses Maria's public key to encrypt the message and he sends it to her. Maria then uses her private key to decrypt the message. And this could represent any number of transactions, any number of client application scenarios, but that's how the keys are used. Everyone else can use your public key to encrypt a message, and you can use your own private key to decrypt, which ensures anyone can send you an encrypted message, but only you can decrypt. So let's take a look at some examples of symmetric and asymmetric encryption algorithms. So a few common symmetric encryption algorithms. We have Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES as it's commonly called. It's the current industry gold standard, highly efficient, widely implemented, offers various key lengths from 128 to 256 bits, providing some flexibility in security levels. We have Triple DES, which is a variation of the data encryption standard, applying the encryption 3 times. Triple DES is being phased out and replaced by AES, where it has not been already. 2 other examples, there's Twofish, a finalist in the competition where ultimately AES was selected, known for its flexibility and security, and then Blowfish, which was the predecessor to Twofish, also known for its strength and speed. A bit of trivia, Twofish and Blowfish were both written by Bruce Schneier of Schneier on Security, who's written some of the most popular books on security and encryption ever published. Reminder, symmetric algorithms are used for bulk data encryption. And if I had to guess which of these algorithms would be most likely to be mentioned on the exam, I would say it's AES. It's widely used in the Microsoft ecosystem, a go-to in the US military in some very high security operations with a 256-bit key. I'd guess it'd be that one. So how about some asymmetric encryption algorithms? We have RSA, one of the oldest and most widely used asymmetric algorithms, named after its creators, often used for key exchange and digital signatures. Its security relies on the difficulty of factoring large prime numbers. Then we have elliptic curve cryptography, or ECC, which is a more modern approach using elliptic curves. It offers similar security levels to RSA, but with smaller key sizes, and that is the key element to remember with ECC. It makes ECC suitable for resource-constrained environments. Think IoT devices with limited memory and processing resources. We have Diffie-Hellman, primarily a key exchange protocol allowing 2 parties to establish a shared secret key over an insecure channel. And then El-Gamal, an algorithm based on the difficulty of the discrete logarithm problem used for encryption and digital signatures. As for mention on the exam, I'd say any of these could come up. El-Gamal would be the least likely. So to revisit our common uses, AES 256 would be a common symmetric encryption scenario. And then on the asymmetric side, we've got RSA, Diffie-Hellman, elliptic curve, or ECC. A few cipher types you should be familiar with. First is the stream cipher, which is a symmetric key cipher, where plain text digits are combined with a pseudo-random cipher digit stream, also known as a key stream. It's basically a sequence of pseudo-random bits or digits, depending on the system, that's generated by a cryptographic algorithm using a secret key and some initialization vector. What you really need to remember is that each plain text digit is encrypted one at a time with the corresponding digit of the key stream to create a digit of the ciphertext, the encrypted data stream. So the plain text is unencrypted, the ciphertext is encrypted data. Then we have a block cipher, which is a method of encrypting text in which a cryptographic key and algorithm are applied to a block of data, for example, 64 contiguous bits, all at once, as a group, rather than to 1 bit at a time. Block cipher is generally considered to be more secure than stream cipher. Next, we have the substitution cipher, which uses the encryption algorithm to replace each character or bit of the plaintext message with a different character. You don't see these in active use. They're really historical at this point. You have the Caesar cipher. and the Vigenère cipher. And the transposition cipher, which rearranges the order of plain text letters according to a specific rule. The message itself is left unchanged, just the order is scrambled. Examples here would include the rail fence cipher and columnar transposition. Now let's shift gears and talk cryptographic key length. An effective way to increase the strength of an algorithm is to increase its key length. In fact, the relationship between key length and work factor is exponential. A small increase in key length leads to a significant increase in the amount of work required to break the encryption. The work factor. Examples: asymmetric, RSA, the primary public key cryptography algorithm used on the internet. It supports key sizes of 1024, 2048, and 4096. NIST recommends a minimum key length of 2048. On the symmetric side, we have the gold standard, the advanced encryption standard, the go-to for the federal government. It supports key sizes of 128, 192, and 256 bits. A 256-bit key is recommended for best quantum resistance. And I believe the U.S. military still requires AES 256 for top secret data. But remember, doubling the key length from a 128-bit to a 256-bit doesn't make the key twice as strong. It makes it 2 to the 128th times as strong. It's all about the number of possible combinations. Then we have static versus ephemeral keys. So these are the two primary categories of asymmetric keys. So static keys are semi-permanent and they stay the same over a long period of time. A certificate includes an embedded public key matched to a private key, and the key pair is valid for the lifetime of a certificate. Certificates have expiration dates, and systems continue to use those keys until the certificate expires, and 1 to 2 years is a common certificate lifetime. RSA is an example of an algorithm that uses static keys. And then remember, your certificate authority can validate a certificate static key using a certificate revocation list or the online certificate status protocol. Then we have ephemeral keys, which are keys that have very short lifetimes and are recreated for each session. So an ephemeral key pair includes a private ephemeral key and a public ephemeral key. And the system uses these key pairs for a single session and then discards them. So some versions of Diffie-Hellman use ephemeral keys. Now we're going to step into the tools section of 1.4 from the syllabus, and here we have the Trusted Platform Module, or TPM. This is a chip that resides on the motherboard of the device. It's multi-purpose. For example, for storage and management of keys used for full disk encryption solutions. It provides the operating system with access to keys, but prevents drive removal and data access. In addition to full disk encryption, TPM is also leveraged by the secure OS boot process. Next, we have the Hardware Security Module, or HSM, which is a physical computing device that safeguards and manages digital keys, performs encryption and decryption functions for digital signatures, strong authentication, and other cryptographic functions. It's like a TPM, but are often removable or external devices where the TPM is a chip on the motherboard and it's going nowhere. Next, we have the Hardware Root of Trust, which is a line of defense against executing unauthorized firmware on a system. And when certificates are used in full disk encryption, they use a hardware root of trust for key storage. It verifies that the keys match before the secure boot process takes place. So as you might already guess at this point, the Trusted Platform Module and Hardware Security Module are both implementations of a hardware root of trust. And next we have the Key Management System, or KMS. So your cloud service providers offer a cloud service for centralized secure storage and access for your application secrets called a vault. So the name varies by cloud platform. So Azure has Key Vault, AWS has their KMS offering, and Google Cloud Platform also has a KMS Vault, they call it. In this case, a secret is anything that you want to control access to. It could be API keys, passwords, certificates, tokens, or cryptographic keys. The service will typically offer programmatic access via API to support DevOps and the CI/CD process. Access control at a Vault instance level and to secrets stored within is generally assumed. Secrets and keys can generally be protected either by software or by FIPS 140-2 Level 2 validated HSMs, or as time passes, FIPS 140-3. Next, we have the Secure Enclave, which provides a secure and isolated area within a system or application for processing sensitive data. A secure enclave uses hardware-based security mechanisms to create an isolated, trusted execution environment. It allows sensitive data to be processed and stored securely, even in a potentially insecure computing environment. It's also called a trusted execution environment. So in the category of obfuscation, we have steganography, where a computer file, message, image, or video is concealed within another file, message, image, or video, and attackers may hide info in this way to exfiltrate sensitive company data. Obfuscation technologies are sometimes called privacy-enhancing technologies, but not always used for benign ends. Also in this category, we have tokenization, where meaningful data is replaced with a token that is generated randomly, and the original data is held in a vault. It's stateless, it's stronger than encryption, and the keys are not local. And then there's pseudonymization, which is a de-identification procedure in which personally identifiable information fields within a data record are replaced by one or more artificial identifiers, or pseudonyms. Reversal requires access to another data source. And then we have anonymization, which is the process of removing all relevant data so it is impossible to identify the original subject or person. This is only effective if you do not need the identity data. If you want the information about the person so you can establish trends over time and so forth, but you don't need to know the name of the person or any identifiers related to that person, you should be good. Next, we have data minimization, where only necessary data fields required to fulfill the specific purpose should be collected. In other words, we collect the minimum amount of data to meet the stated purpose and manage retention to meet regulations. This is a good practice. Less sensitive data means less cyber risk. And then we have data masking, which is when only partial data is left in a data field. For example, a credit card may be shown as asterisks where we only see the last 4 digits. This is commonly implemented in the database tier, but it's also possible in code of your front-end applications. But data masking is very common in the database tier, and when you get into the cloud with platform as a service database offerings, oftentimes they'll have a data masking feature where they will recommend a masking strategy for you proactively based on what the service sees in the database. Next, we have hashing. I think it helps to compare hashing to encryption to really appreciate the difference. So encryption is a two-way function. What is encrypted can be decrypted with the proper key, where on the other hand, hashing is a one-way function that scrambles plain text to produce a unique message digest, a hash. And there's no way to reverse a hash if properly designed. A few common uses of hashing: verification of digital signatures, generation of pseudo-random numbers, integrity services, data integrity and authenticity. We can use a hash for file integrity monitoring and validation of data transfer. A file will have a known hash. If a file has been changed, that hash will be different, at which point in a file integrity monitoring scenario, we know that something has changed. And when we're transferring data, when we're transferring a file, we can generate a hash of the file before we transfer and another hash after, and compare the two, and if they match, then the data is intact. Its integrity remains. So let's just add those common uses of hashing to our list we used previously for symmetric and asymmetric encryption. So we can see from the list here how these work together. So we talked about asymmetric encryption being used as a way to securely transmit that shared key from our symmetric algorithm. So asymmetric algorithms are used for digital signatures, and a hash function can verify a digital signature. So again, these technologies working together. Just to wrap up hashing, a good hash function has 5 requirements. So hash functions must allow input of any length. They must provide fixed length output. So no matter the length of the input, the output will be the same size. They need to make it relatively easy to compute the hash function for any input. They provide one-way functionality, meaning when the hash is generated, it cannot be reversed. And a hash function should be collision-free. And what that means is that no two inputs should ever generate the same output. And it's number 5 that is precisely the reason why MD5 is limited in the scenarios where it's used, because it is at some level prone to collision. For ease of reference as you prepare for the exam, I've put the differences between algorithm types into a table for you. So starting with the number of keys, a hash algorithm has no keys. It's a one-way function. Symmetric cryptography is a shared key, a single shared key used by any number of parties. And in asymmetric cryptography, every party in a discussion has their own public-private key pair. So it's 2 keys per times the number of parties. The recommended key length. So for hashing, 256 bits is the hash block size because it doesn't have a key. It's not reversible. For symmetric, 128 at the lower end if we think about AES. And for asymmetric, for our public-private key pair, 2048 is the NIST recommendation, 2048 bits. Common examples. We've got SHA for hashing, symmetric algorithm AES is the gold standard, and RSA is one of the oldest asymmetric algorithms out there today. Speed, so in terms of encrypting data, symmetric is very fast for bulk encryption. Hashing needs to generate that hash value quickly. Asymmetric for bulk encryption is going to be relatively slow, but it plays that role in other areas, like helping us with secure transfer of a shared key, digital signatures, non-repudiation. Then we have complexity. So asymmetric is going to be the most complex of the lot. The effective key compromise. So with hashing, there is no key. It's a one-way function. With symmetric encryption, if we lose our key, if our key is compromised, everybody in the equation is compromised, sender and receiver. So the only key you can lose in asymmetric is your private key. And the one who loses in that case is the owner of that private key. So if you have 10 parties in a conversation and party number 10 loses their private key or it's compromised, everybody else is perfectly safe, accepting the fact that the holder of that private key for user number 10 can then decrypt any messages sent to that user. Key management. So key management in the symmetric scenario is challenging because secure transfer of that key to multiple parties is our challenge. But that's easy with asymmetric. And then I have examples of each of these algorithms. We talked through many of these. For the hash family, you're looking at the secure hash algorithm family there. So you'll see SHA and you'll see MD5 or MD6 called out pretty frequently. And remember, on symmetric, it's really 128 bits or more for some sensitive data types. I believe I mentioned that in the military for top secret data, it's a 256-bit key. But this is always evolving, and it's eventually going to be affected by quantum computing, so this is all going to change eventually. So hopefully this makes for a convenient reference page as you're preparing for the exam. Next, we have the process of salting, which involves the use of cryptographic salts. Attackers may use rainbow tables, which contain pre-computed values of cryptographic hash functions to identify commonly used passwords. It's a table of password hashes. And a salt is random data that is used as an additional input to that one-way hash function for the password or the passphrase. So adding salt to the passwords before hashing reduces the effectiveness of rainbow table attacks, because the expected output of the hash function for a common password is going to be different because a random value was added. So even if every user in our environment used a common password, a rainbow table wouldn't help because the salt changes the output of the hash, of that hashing process. Next, we have digital signatures. So digital signatures are similar in concept to handwritten signatures on printed documents that identify individuals, but they provide more security benefits. It's an encrypted hash of a message encrypted with the sender's private key. So in a signed email scenario, a digital signature provides 3 benefits. Authentication. It positively identifies the sender of the email. Ownership of a digital signature secret key is bound to a specific user. So that means we also get non-repudiation. The sender cannot later deny sending the message. This is sometimes required with online transactions, and the fact that that digital signature secret key is bound to that user gives us non-repudiation. And integrity. This provides assurance that the message has not been modified or corrupted. That way recipients know that the message was not altered in transit. These are the basics important for the Security Plus exam. For good measure, I want to touch on the Digital Signature Standard, or DSS. So the Digital Signature Standard uses SHA-2 and SHA-3 message digest functions, hashing algorithms. To hash the message, it creates a fingerprint of sorts, which is good for the integrity, and it also makes it less work for the asymmetric algorithms that actually create the digital signature to do their work. And DSS works in conjunction with one of 3 asymmetric encryption algorithms: the digital signature algorithm, or DSA, the RSA algorithm, or elliptic curve DSA. So the DSS is documented in FIPS 186-4 at the URL here. DSS may not come up on this exam, but you've got your introduction now just in case. So let's talk key stretching. So I want to start with key length. So some cipher suites are easier to crack than others. Larger keys tend to be more secure because there are more possible key combinations. So key stretching are processes used to take a key that may be weak and to make it stronger by making it longer and more random. A longer key has more combinations a brute force attack has to go through to crack. Since 2015, NIST recommends a minimum of a 2048-bit key for RSA, for example. That will change over time as computing power advances. Quantum computing will eventually impact this recommendation. Next, we have blockchain, which was originally the technology that powered Bitcoin, but it has broader uses today. So it's a distributed public ledger that can be used to store financial, medical, or other transactions. Anyone is free to join and participate. It does not use intermediaries such as banks and financial institutions. Data is chained together with a block of data holding both the hash for that block and the hash of the preceding block. To create a new block on the chain, the computer that wishes to add the block solves a cryptographic puzzle and sends that solution to the other computers participating in that blockchain as proof. This is known as proof of work. Next, we have the open public ledger, and I think the easiest way to understand an open public ledger is to compare its characteristics to the blockchain. So the first is decentralization. Blockchain is decentralized. It is distributed across a peer-to-peer network with no central authority. An open public ledger, on the other hand, can be centralized and maintained by a single entity. Immutability. So blockchain data is immutable and cryptographically secured. Once data is added to the blockchain, it is extremely difficult to alter, whereas data on a public ledger can be changed more easily. Then there's the matter of validation. Blockchain uses consensus mechanisms like proof of work or proof of stake to validate new data added to the chain. Public ledgers rely on the integrity of the central authority. And finally, transparency. Blockchain transactions can be pseudonymous for privacy, meaning written under a false name or a pseudonym. Public ledger transactions are typically fully transparent. Since Section 1.4 is focused on appropriate cryptographic solutions, I have a bit of a bonus section at the end here for you, and I'm going to take you through some common use cases and limitations that will give you context for applying these technologies on the exam. So let's talk through a few common scenarios for specific cryptographic choices. Low-power devices, for example. These devices often use ECC, elliptic curve cryptography, for encryption, as it uses a small key. IoT devices and the little Pi type devices don't have the processing power for conventional encryption often, so ECC fits the bill for that use case. Low latency. This means encryption and decryption should not take a long time. Specialized encryption hardware is a common answer in this scenario. A VPN concentrator or encryption accelerator cards can improve efficiency. High resiliency. Using the most secure encryption algorithm practical to prevent the encryption key from being cracked by attackers. Device, application, or service compatibility may influence your decisions here. One scenario that comes to mind was the key length on our certificates, on our public-private key pairs with certain legacy network devices. These legacy devices would only support a 1024 key length. We couldn't go to 2048, which is the bit length recommended by NIST, because we had to accommodate for those legacy devices. And supporting confidentiality. Encryption should be implemented for exchange of any sensitive data and in a way that ensures only authorized parties can view. For example, connecting remote offices via an IPsec VPN. So traffic between the offices is always encrypted. Supporting integrity. So two scenarios that come to mind: ensuring file data has not been tampered with and communications are not altered in transit. So we can use a file hash to check file integrity, a digital signature for an email. Then we have obfuscation. So obfuscation is commonly used in source code or with data to ensure it can't be read by anyone who steals it. There we have steganography, tokenization, data masking can all be used to obscure data. Supporting authentication. So we know a single-factor username and password are not considered secure, as theft of the password leads to compromise. That's where MFA, multi-factor authentication for user authentication, certificate-based authentication for devices, gives us a stronger solution. Supporting non-repudiation. So when you digitally sign an email with your private key, you cannot deny it was you, as there is only one private key. It's tied to you. Non-repudiation is important in any legally binding transaction. We need to ensure neither party can deny having consented to the transaction. And to touch briefly on limitations. So speed, for example. Application and hardware have to be able to keep pace with the selected encryption, which was why we talked about ECC being such a great fit for IoT scenarios due to its smaller key size. Size. If we're encrypting 16 bytes of data with a block cipher, the encrypted information is also 16 bytes. That overhead has to be considered in resource planning. We need enough memory, storage, and network to support the result. Weak keys. We know larger keys are generally stronger and thus more difficult to break. We need to find the balance between security, compatibility with our devices, and capacity. So in that network hardware scenario I mentioned, NIST recommends the 2048-bit key in our certificate scenario, but we had legacy network devices that only supported 1024. So we might have to make a decision there between using a weaker key and replacing that legacy hardware. Time. Encryption and hashing take time. Larger amounts of data and asymmetric encryption take more time than small data and symmetric encryption. So your selections need to match time constraints in transactions. And longevity. So consider how long encryption algorithms selected can be used. Older algorithms will generally be retired sooner, as will scenarios where you select a smaller key size, because you will be impacted by larger compute, by quantum, sooner. Predictability. So cryptography relies on randomization. Random number generation that can't be easily predicted is crucial for any type of cryptography. Reuse. We know using the same key is commonly seen in a number of encryption mechanisms, and if an attacker gains access to the key, they can decrypt data encrypted with it. And while changing those keys out frequently is great, some IoT devices may not allow for a key change, which might lead us to use a stronger key than we would otherwise. Entropy. A measure of randomness or diversity of a data-generating function. So data with full entropy is completely random with no meaningful patterns. Cryptography relies on that randomness. And always consider your resource versus security constraints. The more secure the encryption used, the higher the key length, the more processing power and memory your server or other device will need. It just requires a balance between algorithms and hardware selections. And congratulations, my friends. That brings us to the end of section 1.4. I hope you're getting value from the series. That does it for Domain 1. So if you have any questions in the meantime, reach out in the comments here on YouTube or ping me directly on LinkedIn. And I'll look forward to seeing you back for Domain 2. So until next time, take care and stay safe.